Erev Tov, Yafo. Good morning, Burlington. Greetings. My name's Wayne Firestone. It's Sunday, sometime in your time zone, and we are thrilled at America-Israel Friendship League that you're here with us, making some new friends and seeing some great art and reconnecting with our favorite tour guide of art galleries, Gabriela, who's with us and is going to share some unique art. First of all, let's do some community building. Tell us maybe about an exhibit in your hometown that you've seen, something that you find inspiring that people should know about. And just to keep it open-ended, if that happens to be an exhibit of your kid at school or grandchild or someone else in the family that brings you joy, go ahead and put that in there too. Or if it's one of the great impressionists or something that's new and modern that you've seen at a local gallery, let us know about it. Give it a little love. We want to lift up the creators today and people that are making art happen in lots of different ways. And that is indeed one of the themes that we have returned to time and time again with Gabriela Vainsencher, who I love. Seeing the curation side of many new artists that some of us have never heard about from the United States, that are being exhibited in the United States, and as well as in Israel and other parts of the world. And indeed, Gabrielle has put together today for us a collection of very, very different artists, different backgrounds, different genders, different identities, different religions, but under the same umbrella of self-discovery. So Gabriela, maybe let's start a little bit with just at a very high 10,000 foot level in your own journey, in your own as an artist and in looking at other artists. When is it like abundantly obvious that somebody is sort of telling their own narrative through their work? And when do artists, find that maybe they want that to be more subtle and a little bit more in the background? And how are we going to explore that a little bit in the artists you chose today?
That's a great question, Wayne. I think when it's clear, it's very, very clear because it speaks to you on a very personal level. There are a lot of artists who make work that's very abstract, that is very intellectually rigorous, that is sometimes very research-based, and that's something you feel from the work when you walk into the space. This art is about systems, or this art is about theory, or this art is about color. But the artists that we're seeing today, I think it kind of screams from their work that there's personal content here. There's biography, there's grappling with various issues in the artist's life, and each artist solves this and searches for this in a very different way. But I think it's so abundantly clear when you see the work. Yeah.
Well, thanks for putting together this group. I know there's a lot of, as always, a lot of material to cover and to digest. So we'll take it in the order that you present it, and we'll certainly leave some time for questions at the end. But if anything comes screaming out at us earlier, yeah, we'll see if we can get a few questions or comments in along the way.
Yeah, wonderful. Please jump in. You'll be monitoring the chat. I won't be, but please jump in with any questions that you feel like should really be answered in the moment.
Super.
Okay, so I'm going to start sharing my screen with you. For those of you who haven't met me yet, I'll just tell you I am an artist and a curator. I'm based now in Jersey, but was in New York for 15 years. And all the work we're going to see today is exhibitions that have been seen around New York City's various galleries in the last few months. Some of them just closed. Some of my favorite work on display right now. We're going to be kind of bouncing around between Tribeca and Chelsea, which are two of the biggest art neighborhoods in New York. That's just to give you kind of the time and place. But the artists who make this work all come from very different backgrounds, very different attitudes, very different techniques. Okay, so let's jump in. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, here we go. Can you see my screen okay? No gray areas? All good? Okay,
Yep.
wonderful. Okay, so we're starting from an exhibition, like you can see in the corner, by an artist named Tao Lewis. This is at Zwirner Gallery, which some of you may know as a Chelsea gallery. Those of you who live in New York or go to see shows in New York. Zwirner is one of the biggest galleries in New York and in the world. They have international branches all over the world. But this is actually their Tribeca space. It's a new gallery that they opened. They don't even really call it Zwirner officially. They call it 52 Walker Street, which is the address. And that kind of putting it a little bit at a distance from the gallery's brand identity is on purpose. It's because here they're focusing on showing shows, showing exhibitions by not artists that they represent, not artists they work with regularly, but this is more like their project space. This is where they show younger artists, artists who they wouldn't necessarily represent at this point of their career, but are doing something really, really interesting and really hot right now. And this is one of the first exhibitions in the space. And Tao Lewis, I brought you a little picture of her. I like to see what the people look like who make the work, is a very young artist. She is now 29 years old and has been in the past few years really kind of blowing up in the international art scene. And her latest, most biggest exposure came from a few works that she contributed to the Venice Biennial. So the big, every 2 years, there's the biennial in Venice. Each country has its own pavilion where they usually have a solo show by a prominent artist and they represent the country. But there's also the Arsenale, which is a large sprawling space where the curators of the biennial, in this one, Cecilia Almani, curate a group show that has nothing to do with the international pavilions. And in it, it's almost like a statement about the state of the art, or what they want to focus on this year, or what's important in the art world this year. And this year's show was called The Milk of Dreams, and it was inspired by, The Milk of Dreams is a name of a work by Leonora Carrington, who was a very prominent surrealist. There's a lot of work by her at the MoMA Museum right now. And it featured almost exclusively women, transgender artists, and had a very, very, very strong feminist and surrealist presence. And Tao Lewis's works that you see here, these two giant mask sculptures, were some of the standouts and some of the most kind of discussed and Instagrammed and loved works in the show. And you can really see how, if I say surrealism, if I say dreamlike, even that title, The Milk of Dreams, is such a surrealist, kind of almost like a little poem. You can see how her work fits right in, right? On one hand, it looks like something from a fantasy or from a dream, but it's also so tactile. We're going to get a close-up look at some of this work soon. Here's another one of her large pieces. She just started working at this scale in the past few years. I think probably the opportunity to present work at the biennial was a kind of an opportunity to scale up. And these works are all made from cloth, fabric, and leather and fur scraps. So let's take a close-up look. You can see they are hand sewn together. She doesn't send this out to a professional place to sew them. She sews them herself. Now she has a couple of assistants who work with her to just help her make the work. A lot of her materials she sources, either she goes to, fabric shops or places where they fix coats or make coats, furriers. A lot come from her own personal collections. She thrifts a lot. She has clothing handed down from family members. And she puts everything together. What I like about zooming in on her work is you really see how Every piece is a different shape, is a different color. And with this, all this detail, you get that really dense, rich look of this mask that eventually comes together to a face that's, you can see here in the picture with the viewer next to it, is kind of larger than us, larger than life. It's really like coming close to some sort of monster or dream creature. Here's her studio. This is her studio in Brooklyn. So she currently lives in New York, but she grew up in Canada. She is Jamaican Canadian. So dad's from Jamaica, mom is from Canada, dad is Black, mom is white. And a lot of her work is about sourcing materials from the different places that she calls home. So if you see all these scraps next to her laptop, she goes around the thrift stores around where she lives now in Brooklyn and before in Canada, but also when she goes to visit family in Jamaica, she'll pick up seashells, she'll pick up rocks. You can see there's a little bowl of beads there. Those are beads that her grandma used to braid into her hair. So a lot of the stuff is both from the places that she's from and from her own life. And the work is very, very personal in that way. It's important to her that she collects the materials to make these giant works. It's important to her that sometimes she hides little treasures in them, little pieces of jewelry or things that have some sort of personal biographical meaning to her. And you can see very much the masks are both beautiful and colorful, but there's also something sometimes a little dark about them, sometimes a little scary. But they're made with so much love and so much dedication to detail. Now, before we jump back into the show, I brought you a little video of Tao Lewis speaking about her work. She's talking in the video I'm going to show you. She's going to talk about, as you see, a series of smaller works. We'll also see some of those and talk about them. This is a video that was made about her a couple of years ago. But you'll get to see how she works with the material, how she hand sews. You'll see her studio with all the scraps. You'll hear how she talks about the work, and then we'll keep going. So here is a minute and a half with Tao Lewis.
I'm Tao Lewis. I am a self-taught sculptor. I'm from Toronto, Canada. I recently moved to Brooklyn. I work primarily with textiles, fabric, a lot of recycled and found objects, somewhat of an assemblage approach to construction. This edition specifically is very much sort of rooted in and pulling from the imaginary, but made with sort of commonplace materials that one would be quite familiar with. I have archives of different fabrics, materials, leather, a lot of which are personal belongings. So, I cycle through jewelry, I cycle through clothing. Those then become materials that I work with and then embed into the sculptures. There are scraps of different fabrics and leathers in these works, some of which, I've held onto for several years. And I do this in order to sort of continue a lineage in the DNA of these objects. I love working in leather because it's, a natural material and it's also a flesh. It's something I like to be quite tender with, and when I use my hands, the material has a way of kind of revealing itself. There's a certain handmade quality to the things that I make, and everything is unique. You can really see the hours in each individual piece. No seam is perfect. No line is completely straight. Each stitch is individual. It's a very labor-intensive, time-consuming process. It's a commitment. They're each embedded with this sort of love and this energy.
So that's her speaking about her work. And there you saw her working with very small work, but I think a lot of that energy, and at the end you see her standing over some drawings that are sort of preparatory drawings for the work. And I feel like you really still see how even in the bigger works, those drawings, that energy of that loose line and those very expressive faces still comes across even when the work is 10 feet tall. Now, just technically speaking, the way these pieces are made is this is the only thing she doesn't do herself in the studio. She orders a metal frame, basically, almost like a car frame, very heavy metal frame that is constructed for her, more or less to the general shape of the face that she's going to make. And then on top of that, she covers it in fabric and in various materials, and then starts sewing the scraps of leather and fabric onto them. So it all happens on the wall, on this kind of metal skeleton that she has made. So that's how the work is made. And now that she works with assistants, usually she'll create almost like a palette of leather and fabric, so they know what are the textures, what are the colors, what scraps are we using, and then they all work together to put it on the framework. So it starts from a drawing, then there's the metal skeleton, and then there's the many hours of labor of actually stitching this directly onto the structure. And you can see again how each piece of leather or fabric is cut to a very specific shape, something very organic. It's not like all the same size strip or the same shape, and it gives it that feeling of fur and liveliness. Now, another influence that Lewis has talked a lot about is Yoruba masks. So I brought you some examples of Yoruba masks. Now, when we talk about Yoruba or Yoruba style mask, we're talking about actually a very large swath of both time and space from which these ancient objects come. So if we talk, Yoruba land before in Africa, in West Africa, before European colonialization, was basically spanning over various areas of Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. And as colonialization happened, as movements of people happened, these masks also transformed and keep transforming. But what's important to know is that these Yoruba style masks often feature, first of all, they are made as devotional objects. They're used in rituals and ceremonies, in special dances, and when they are no longer used, they're put back usually in a shrine. They're not made as decorative objects, they're made as objects of devotion. And often they will depict a figure of a mother, a woman. And what you see here and also in the previous mask is a woman, and she has her head wrap on. And the head wrap and the hair turn into very, very sculptural shapes. Sometimes they resemble animals. Sometimes you can see the braiding of the hair. And the mother figure, as it's represented in these Yoruba masks, it's by no means the only image that we see in the Yoruba mask, but it's one that repeats a lot, is of course a protective figure, but also sometimes an ominous figure, right? Like, watch out, don't mess with this mother figure who is protecting who she needs to protect. And Lewis has spoken in many interviews about her taking inspiration from specifically the mother figures in the Yoruba mask. These are, of course, some of her masks, like what we saw. This mask is made from leather, and the eyes are pebbles, painted rocks. Here you can see it. And you can see, like she says, no stitch is the same, no line is perfectly straight. Very, very handmade, very lovingly made. With a lot of detail paid to the hair or the headdress, the decorative earrings. And as she says, there's something about working with leather to depict a body. She says, I'm working with flesh, right? I'm working with flesh and I'm thinking about flesh. So there's also something very, very tactile and very physical. Here's a few more examples, kind of how the head becomes a very, very sculptural area, this area of of fantasy, of wildlife. Often there's animals who become headdresses for the sculptures. And then, of course, when you wear the mask, these are contemporary Yoruba masks. When you wear the mask goes over your own head, and then it has its own mask over its head, right? So it's a sculpture and a mask, one on top of the other. And something that the artist has said publicly that is very connected to this mother figure and is a tragic element from her personal life right now is that a few days after the show opened, it just closed, by the way. A few days after this show opened, Lewis went back to Toronto to be with her mother while her mother underwent medically assisted suicide back in Toronto. So she was saying goodbye to her mother as she was making the work for this show, grieving in advance, of course, and grieving after the show opened. But this desire to create a giant, powerful figure that is protective is something that she talks about a lot. A mother figure, she says, in the studio, I create a very warm environment, a very tactile environment. She said, I'm almost creating a womb for myself. So she's thinking about being mothered as she is losing her mother. Here's another work. This is not in the show. It's an earlier work, but just to show you how much line work and how much drawing goes into her work. It looks like a painting, but it's all stitched leather on leather. So you can see it looks like a drawing, it looks like a painting, but again, it's this sewn collage, a very kind of powerful looking female figure. But also there's something menacing, right, about that female body. These are some more abstract works that she's also been making, but it also shows us how she thinks about texture, how she thinks about color, how she transforms this material, right? Always the leather or the faux leather, always the fabric, but they really look like paintings. Here, and this is going back to the show. Every mask is different. Every mask has its own palette. Some of them look more menacing. Some of them look more cute. Some of them look more funny. This is this center one again. It's rare, I find, for an artist this young to have found her language so early on and have such a strong, identifiable language. One of the things that the curator of 52 Walker said about her is she said, there's something instantly recognizable about her work. It doesn't look like anybody else's work. You can tell there's references to a lot of different things, a lot of different traditions, a lot of different artists, but it doesn't look like anybody else. So I'm always very interested in artists who start off so strong, so young, to see what happens later. And then, you know, when an artist starts so young, you have many, many years to follow their career. This is a detail from this mask that we just saw that has all these hanging flowers, almost like braids coming off of it. And I want to show you a little bit from the studio. This is how a lot of the pieces start. So she'll make a drawing, then she'll make kind of a more colored drawing, and then she'll start building her palette from the leather and fabric pieces that she has in her studio. And then something like this will become something like this. It's really a drawing and a painting translated into 3D, into a sculpture. And I think that's also part of the reason that her work always finds itself on the wall, right? She's a sculptor, but her work doesn't sit in the middle of the room. It's because she really thinks like a painter. She thinks like someone who draws, who paints. She thinks two-dimensionally, even though the work ends up kind of being a relief from the wall. But that's something that's been consistent with all the large pieces, is they really live on the wall, kind of like paintings. So this is Tao Lewis at 52 Walker's Werner Gallery.
Gabriela, we have one question maybe we can get in before you move on. And you started getting at it, but Deborah is asking about influences or influencers on Tao's work and mentioned Oldenburg. And I know you said that there's a unique quality even for such a young artist, but are there specific people who are considered the masters or the influencers in pieces like this, or it's really hard to name anyone in particular?
It is hard to name someone in particular. I don't feel like she's really riffing off of one person, but Klaus Oldenburg is a nice example because for those of you who don't know, he was a pop artist who made large sculptures of everyday objects from vinyl, mostly vinyl material or fabric scraps. So he would make a giant toilet or a giant hamburger, very much like pop art objects, but they would be huge. They would be three-dimensional in the wall and they would be sewn together. So he called them soft sculpture. So they were always kind of a little deflated. So there's that definitely in the materials. But I think about a lot of African-American artists working today look back at kind of assemblage techniques that originate in Africa, or actually work with studios in Africa and there's this thing of taking a lot of materials and cobbling it together into larger work. So that's something that I see actually in the US, this kind of way of working that I think is definitely an influence for her. But she's totally one of a kind. Her work is very, very special. And I think that's why it stood out even in the biennial. So should we move on?
Yes, please.
All right. So the next artist I want to show you, this is a show that opened a few months ago at Sycamore Jenkins Gallery in Chelsea. And here you see kind of an overview of the show and the biggest work in the show, which will also be our focus. And this is by American artist Yashua Klos. I brought you a little picture of him. So Yashua, we'll also see a little video of him, both telling a little bit of his story and showing us a little bit of his process very soon. I actually want to start with him and then kind of jump into my slideshow. But the thing to know about him, about the show before we watch his video is this is a show that just migrated downstate from his first big museum exhibition. So all the work here was made in preparation for his first museum solo show in upstate New York. And this show puts together both his technical interest as an artist. He's a printmaker. Everything you see here has been printed with woodblock, and I'll explain a little bit how woodblock works, and his own search for his family, for his history, for his identity. But before I tell you about him, I want to have Yashua tell you a little bit about himself. So we're going to watch a 2-minute video of him working in the studio. It's also easier to understand when I explain to you the technique of how he works. It's easier to understand if you've seen him do it. So here he is, and then we'll jump back.
I didn't grow up with a large family, raised by my mom, south side of Chicago, only child raised without a father. And I think in my search for masculine identity, I turned to those natural resources around me in the environment as cues on how to posture, behave, and appear to be a man. it's a process that I think in some ways is like really complex because there's so many stages to it. It's so layered, but at the same time, it's like it doesn't get a lot more basic than carving a piece of wood and inking it for its impression. Our labor is about certainly the invisible labor that Black folks have contributed to building America. But more than that, our labor is about the labor that I'm doing and that my family is doing in order to connect. I'm learning from them all of the labor, all the love and the work that it takes to hold a family together. I learned from my mother, actually, that family is who you learn to survive for and who you learn to survive from. You know, the Our Labor mural, that was an expression of my generosity to my family as a way of saying, I know I've been gone for so long, and this is what I have to contribute. This is what I do.
So it's a little bit from him. So let me tell you a little bit about him. He a little bit hints at his family, on one hand raised by a single mother without his father, and on the other hand he talks about a big family. So let me tell you a little bit about this, because this is the genesis story for this exhibition. So while during the pandemic, during lockdown, Klos decides, like many bored Americans, to do 23andMe, right? To do this genealogy thing, to send his DNA sample and see what happens. Now, Klos in his career has been thinking about race his whole life. As you can see, he considers himself a very light-skinned Black man, and his father wasn't around, his mother raised him, and a lot of his work previously to making this work was about thinking about race in America and an ancient African history prior to slavery, and what it means to be a man and what it means to be a Black man in America. And when he did this 23andMe, he says in an interview, he had this fantasy, right, that he was gonna uncover these deep historic African roots, maybe some royalty. You know, he had these fantasies about his African history as an African American. But what he got very right after he did his results is he got an email on Facebook. He got a message with this picture of himself, a picture of himself that he'd never seen before, saying like, hey, I think we're cousins. This came up on my 23andMe. And also we have this picture of you from when you were 7 in our backyard. And it turns out that his father, who he had only met twice in his life, one of those meetings was when he was 7 here, and he took him from Chicago to Detroit to meet his family, a huge extended family. And they remember him from this picnic, this kind of lost looking, shy kid of 7. And after they found him again because of 23andMe, they fully embraced him and said, you know, come be in the family, come meet everybody, come to Detroit, meet your family, meet your family history. So he found a lot of roots, but not where he thought and not when he thought. It turns out his father was one of 13 children, and they all had lots of children, and they all had lots of grandchildren. And so he has a huge extended family. So while he's going back and forth to Detroit to meet his family, he visits the Art Institute of the Arts in Detroit, which houses one of Diego Rivera's most beautiful and largest murals in the world, which Rivera made for the Ford Auto Company, for which many of Yashua Klos's family members have worked throughout the ages. So he talks a little bit about how Black Americans helped build America and helped build the middle class. And he's talking about his family working at Ford Industries. So Rivera's mural, Rivera was, as you know, Rivera was Frida Kahlo's husband, right? A huge socialist artist who made huge mural works and often kind of glorifying the socialist endeavor, the workers working towards the creation of a new society, etc. And this is what this mural represents. And Klos became very, very fascinated and enamored of this work by Rivera, of the people kind of becoming one with the machine. And he said, I want to make my own version of this thing. I want to make my own version thinking about my family's participation in this factory, in this endeavor, in this building of not just cars, but of the middle class and of the Midwest. And he starts working on this giant mural that is on display at the gallery. So here it is being rolled out. This is actually at the museum, not at the gallery. And here it is in full length. So you can see at the center there, I'm going to zoom in a moment, is Yashua Klos's grandmother, his paternal grandmother, holding an engine. And he says, I placed her in the center because she's like the engine that holds this whole thing together. And then we're going to see a few more details, but you should know every figure in this mural is an actual family member of Klos's. Because he said, another thing I really needed to start doing is memorizing everybody's names. Like he's used to having one family member, his mother. And suddenly he's part of this huge extended family. And he said, so I had everybody send me selfies or pictures or family pictures, and I started putting them into my work. So each of these is a portrait of a cousin or a second cousin or an aunt or an uncle. And the way they are made is they're actually various pieces of cloth that he makes by printmaking. So let me tell you a little bit about how he works. And he explained this a little bit in the video, and I'll just want to jump back into it. So the way you make a woodblock print is you take a piece of wood, it can be plywood, it can be anything, and you make a drawing on it or a painting, and then you use a carving tool like that to start carving the lines that you've drawn into the wood. This is going to create depressions in the wood, right, and scratches in the wood. So it's first to make a painting, a drawing, but then to actually carve out each and every line you've made. So you can see how he sometimes works from reference images and then creates all the texture with the carving tool. Then you ink the plate. So you see him rolling a roller of ink. Printmaking ink is oil-based ink. It's very thick, so it just stays on the surface. It doesn't leak into the cracks. Then you put a piece of fabric in Klos's case, but you could put also paper or anything that you can put on, and then he presses this down manually. So he doesn't even have a printing press. This is a printmaker who does everything by hand. No presses, no machines. He uses something that almost looks like an iron on it. And then what happens is when you peel the image off, this is still from the video, you get a print. This is what is called a mono print, because mono means one. That's because every time you ink a plate and put paper or fabric on it and lift it up, the print is a little bit different, a little bit unique. So hence it's called a mono print. Then he'll take this piece of cloth, cut it up around the edges, and start and sew it or glue it onto this giant fabric. His studio is not big enough to hold this giant mural. He worked on it in sections. knowing that he'll have a big enough wall at the museum or the gallery. So every single part of this mural is made with this technique. So now when you see these details that I'm showing you, you can see how the lines that are white are where he carved the wood and the ink didn't go in. And then everywhere else is where the ink touched the plate and then touched the fabric. So it's both a labor of drawing and then painting, right? Like putting more or less ink, darker or lighter ink on various areas. It's work of carving, of making the line into a three-dimensional channel through the wood, and then of actually producing the print from this image. Here are a few more of the portraits. The rest of the gallery had these singular portraits that are a lot more colorful. They're also made with the same technique of printing in pieces and then putting the pieces together. These are all cousins also, portraits of cousins. And here I brought you kind of a side-by-side of a general look and a more detailed look. Here you can see he's creating the skin tone, but also the shading that makes the face three-dimensional from different shades of brown and also and reds and pinks. And he's picking up the grain of the wood, which is another thing you can do very beautifully when you're printing from actual woodblock, is the wood itself has grain. He turns the wood grain into the pores in the skin of his family members. All these images have a lot of flowers added to them. They're very decorative, they're very beautiful. And he said, I didn't want to make, even though the show is called Our Labor, and the main work is called Our Labor, he said, I didn't want to just make images of African-American people working hard. He said, I feel like that's an image that's been seen over and over again. He said, I wanted to also make an image that connects Black faces to pleasure, to beauty, to leisure. So that's another side that I want to show of my family, not just my family at work, but also someone's hand just holding a flower. And look at the beautiful detail of the flower next to the acrylic nail, next to that three-dimensional pattern in the background that looks like something that comes from furniture or from architecture. So many different textures and colors, and you really feel both the skin tone and the flower petal and the nail, celebrating the beauty of his family. Here's another detail. There's one more area in the show, the entrance area, that has a black wall, again with masks. We're back with masks from a very different perspective this time, but here is another contemporary Black artist who is thinking about ancient African masks. And for Klos, remember I told you how he had this fantasy that he was going to find these kind of ancient African roots, and instead he found very contemporary African-American family. These works are kind of a melding of those two. So each work is a copy or a kind of changed up copy of an African mask from very different regions and very different kinds. He's not so specific about them, but they're all put together with the shape of the welding mask. So each mask is, there's an African mask part and there's a welding mask part. Here's another. So always there's the kind of more sculptural, more ancient looking mask, and then it's superimposed or mashed up with a welding mask. And of course, this is putting the two together, right? The ancient African history and the welding mask of the actual relative who worked in the factory. They're all scorched and burned. Of course, this is a reference a little bit to the welding activity itself, but he says it's also how I kind of put them together, how I activate them, how they go through almost like a ritual together to be put together in the studio. So that's Yashua Klos at Sycamore Jenkins Gallery. And Wayne, I don't know if you had any pressing questions.
Well, we have some pressing comments. Agnes says fabulous. Angelina says simply amazing. I have to echo the reactions, particularly looking at the intricacy of the shading in the faces on wood. It's just really so beautiful and so natural and so connected to this identity journey. When you first told me the story beforehand to introduce Yashua's work, this 23andMe, do you think it will yield more artwork, particularly from people who are discovering their identity from places? We think about family art or connections to different generations from heirlooms and other things that are passed down within a family that are known. And it seems like this work has just opened up a whole new world of self-discovery. I wonder if other artists will begin to explore that as well.
For sure. I mean, I think it's rocking a lot of people's worlds, artists and non-artists. I think, sometimes it creates a lot of family drama. People find siblings they didn't know about and uncover marital affairs no one was supposed to know about. But I think, and like any phenomena that is changing contemporary culture for everybody else, it's also doing that for artists. So I'm sure we're going to see, and we are seeing, a lot of artists are always very interested in themselves, in their biography, in their families, like we all are. So yeah, this is just another aspect of it. Absolutely.
Okay, I know we've got one more really exciting artist to
Yes.
feature. So there are one or two other questions, but let's make sure we give due to all three.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so the last artist I wanted to share with you, here we go, is an artist named Tirtzah Bassel. Here she is. So before I start talking about her, I'm going to give you a quick a caveat and a warning. So the caveat is that Tirtzah is also a very close friend of mine. I know her very well, and that's why I also have a lot of insight into her biography and how it's affected her work. And we're also going to get a little bit of a trajectory, how she got to making the work that she's making today. And the warning, a little bit, maybe we can call it a trigger warning or something like that. Definitely in her later work, the work that I'm going to focus on today, Tirtzah works a lot with pretty iconoclastic images that come from Christian imagery. So there's a lot of Christian iconography, Christian themes of paintings that she changes, that she distorts, that she plays with, that she gender flips. So just so you know, if you feel like that is a sensitive topic for you, then of course you can tune out. That's why we also put her at the end. And the very last thing is, close to the end of the presentation, in her paintings, there is, because it's very influenced by art history, there's a lot of nudity in the paintings. And specifically for Tirtzah's paintings, there's a lot of male frontal nudity. So if that bothers you, then please be aware it's going to be close to the end of the presentation. So to kind of jump back into Tirtzah's work, Tirtzah started making a name for herself in New York. She's an American Israeli artist. She was born here, but she was raised in Israel. She was raised in an Orthodox family with multiple siblings, very conservative. But she started making a name for herself here in New York, actually not with painting, but with these works that are installation, completely site-specific, always made on-site at the gallery, with masking tape. So she was actually trained as a classical painter by one of Israel's most prominent classical painters, which gave her, I think, the skills to create realistic work from packing tape and masking tape, which is technically very, very hard. And the work that she was making then had everything to do, she'd made a lot of work about security, going through security in airports, being checked, being in mundane situations where you're also observed and exposed. A lot of scenes from daily life, waiting in line at the supermarket, at the store, life-size paintings of these kind of, on one hand, grand paintings, but on the other hand, a very, very mundane situations. When she had her first child, she has 2 kids now, and she is secular and has an American non-Jewish partner. She started making work that had to do with motherhood, with babies in public. It's one of my favorite paintings from that era, a yoga, mommy and me yoga class, but it also looks, they kind of look like Stonehenge in their massive figures. So the imagery of motherhood and of babies and motherhood starts trickling into Tirtzah's work at this point. And it also becomes more and more personal. We even see the point of view changing from, this is a painting made from the point of view of the woman pushing the supermarket cart. And I love how these 2 pieces kind of fit together, almost like rowing a boat by yourself. And then another point of view that every nursing mother knows, the double breast pump, maybe the least provocative way to paint breasts. But all of this to lead to something that also happened to Tirtzah during the pandemic, another pandemic influenced artist, is when she started working on the show that came down last month in Chelsea at Slag Gallery, which is called Canon in Drag. So drag, think drag queen, drag race, right? Someone flipping genders in their presentation. The canon, and in this case, meaning the art historical canon in drag. That's the name of the project and the name of the show. And I brought you, the gallery has a very fun feature where you can take a 3-dimensional tour through the gallery. So here we are, we're entering into the show. Even though it closed already, we can look through it. And you can see, maybe you're already recognizing some images. I just wanted to show you the gallery first so you can see how different scales, different sizes of the work. Some are huge, some are tiny. And I want to start with this piece. So some of you recognize the frame right away, right? Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. But suddenly it's not a woman in there. It's a man. She calls it The Birth of Venus Barbata, Venus with a beard. And what Tirtzah has been doing throughout the process of working on the show is taking kind of some of art history's greatest hits. Here's the original, and thinking, what if not only, it's not just about putting a man on the seashell rather than a woman. It's about imagining a world and an art history in which the perspective of the artist is the perspective of a woman. And the person who is always naked in front of the artist is a man. A completely kind of almost radically feminist way to think of art history. What if art history was seen from the perspective of women, and men would be the one who were always objectified, always nude, always kind of covering their nakedness? What would that world look like? Not just what would those paintings look like, but what would the mythology of such a world look like? And this took her almost immediately into Christian iconography, because Christianity, of many paintings that are Christian, have a lot to do with the with the birth of Jesus, with Jesus as a baby, and that the mother and the father and the baby. So this painting of Tirtzah's is referencing a 1450 altarpiece in which we see it's a nativity scene. We see this time we see the baby Jesus on the ground, kind of on Mary's cloak, and all the angels are looking at it. But suddenly here in Tirtzah's version, the baby is resting on his father, his bare-chested father. His father is seen as the caretaker. And look at the motif on the archway on top of them. It shows the gestational periods, right? The uterus seen from the side with the baby growing inside of it. In the original version, by the way, there's scenes of martyrdom. So also to replace explicit violence with the explicit nudity that has to do with giving birth. And there's a lot of imagery in Tirtzah's work. It's not all about Christianity, that replace a sort of exposure of violence with an exposure that is much more positive and life-filled of pregnancy. So in this painting, which Bassel named The Anatomy Lesson of Louise Bourgeois-Boursier, after Rembrandt, here's the Rembrandt painting, The Anatomy Lesson, in which we see a corpse laid out on the table as the teacher dissects the arm. And we're getting a very explicit, very violent look into the human body. And in Bassel's version, first of all, we see a woman as the teacher, and Louise Bourgeois-Boursier was one of the most preeminent midwives of that same period of Rembrandt's in France, and delivered many royal babies. And she developed many texts and instructional texts and diagrams about how to relieve labor, how to save women, how to save babies. So this is a very different kind of anatomy lesson. And then there's a lot of just plain what if men did this work kind of paintings. So this is of course a reference to Picasso's Blue Period Ironing Woman. Bassel just puts an ironing man in there. What if we had centuries and centuries of looking at men doing tasks of the home and of childcare and home building? So here's Cézanne's card players, right? Men at leisure, men playing, gambling. And Bassel, she keeps them as men. She doesn't flip the gender, but they are embroidering. They're sewing, right? So we've turned this from a very typical painting of men gambling, smoking, playing, to men doing the hard labor that is associated with women historically. Bassel has this kind of knack that she can copy an artist's style very, very easily. So here's Philip Guston, one of Philip Guston's most famous self-portraits. It's called The Studio. For those of you who don't know, Guston was a Jewish New Yorker painter who made a huge stir when he stopped painting abstract paintings and started depicting himself as a almost like KKK looking figure, a hooded figure. This is a Jewish man painting himself as the kind of epitome of racism and white hate. And he made a huge stir, but also kind of guaranteed his place in art history. His art shows are still being banned sometimes in museums all over the United States. And this is one of his most famous self-portraits, the painter painting himself. By the way, the point of painting himself as a hooded figure is saying none of us is exempt from prejudice. We should all always be very critical of ourselves to see if there's any hint of hate or prejudice in ourselves. which is, I think, a very Jewish concept. And here's Tirtzah's version of the painter, the pregnant painter, painting, gestating in the studio, also smoking a cigarette very reverently, very, very not allowed during pregnancy. But she's painting that same shape we see of her iterated. So not only a woman in the studio, but a pregnant woman in the studio. One of my very favorite paintings in the show is this painting. It's pretty small. And in it, we see, it's called Mother Severing the Umbilical Cord. Now, to those of you who know a little bit of art history, you immediately recognize the source image. This is one of Goya's dark black paintings. This he made during a very dark period in his life. He made a series of paintings directly onto the walls of his own dining room and bedroom in his home, and he painted these monsters. This one is called Saturn devouring his son. There's a Greek myth of Saturn who gets a prophecy that one of his children will kill him. So he goes about and kills all of them before they get to him. And this is one of those gruesome scenes of Goya. And look what Bassel does. She takes that same scene and we see the same kind of madness in the eye of the figure. But instead of committing infanticide, this is a woman who just gave birth and is saving both her life and her child's life by severing the umbilical cord, something you must do to guarantee that life will continue. So it's that craziness in the eyes, it's that insanity, but it's not a murderous insanity of Saturn the father, but the insanity of the crazy of the woman who would do anything to save her baby's life. So here it's not just a gender flip, right? It's a very, very profound flip of the kind of effort, the kind of violence, the kind of sacrifice one would go to for their children. So we're going to see some male nudity. I'm telling you now, this is the next image. So we start from a Rubens painting, no male nudity here, covered up. The origins of the Milky Way. On one hand, this kind of like sweet painting, but there's also a pretty kind of explicit scene of milk spurting out of a woman's breast from 1637. And here's Tirtzah's version, a mom and dad. Mom is sitting quietly, resting, fully dressed, watching dad taking care of the baby. Of course, he's giving him a bottle and the bottle squirts everywhere. So there's also this concept of, let's look at men doing the work, right? And women resting. This is one of Jan van Eyck's most famous paintings, the wedding portrait or the Arnolfini wedding. And Tirtzah, this is again some pretty explicit nudity, this time female. Turns it into the orgasmic birth of Arnolfini. And she said a lot that when she became a mother, she realized art history is so full of nudity, female nudity, so full of blood and gore, and yet the image of birth is almost completely absent from Western art history. So what if I repainted art history with the image of birth as a completely acceptable topic in it? And not only that, Bassel said, what if I also paint the ancient origins of these images? And she writes, by the way, she made a whole catalog in which she wrote the text about every image in the language of artist scholars, not as the artist, but kind of in character as an art historian. And she said, oh, very clearly the Arnolfini birth painting was influenced by ancient Greek vessels of orgasmic births.
Gabriela, we're running a bit over, so I just want to give you a quick prompt, maybe to just run through these last ones or figure out the right place that we can.
I have one more.
Okay.
Okay. So the last one I wanted to show you is Tirtzah's version or response to one of the greatest treasures at the MoMA Museum's collection, the Mademoiselle d'Avignon by Picasso. That this is usually one of the paintings that has the most people in front of it, that and Starry Night. And everyone knows that the Mademoiselle d'Avignon was a red light district in Paris, and that these are portraits of sex workers. And Tirtzah's version of this is right here. What if these were male figures? So on one hand, she is kind of redoing Picasso's style. They're all a little bit cubist, but on the other hand, the nudity is very much a male nudity, and the gaze is the woman's gaze. So this is it. There's many more works in this show, but I kind of showed you some of my highlights from the show.
Gabriela, I feel like we could have spent an hour on each one of these artists in their own respect, but your mastery in putting them together, what a way to send us into Sunday, whether it's the beginning of the week or the end of the week for everyone here. The comments about being thought-provoking, whether it's the gender bending or the critical look at the canon through drag and the various multimedia, from masking tape to wood to masks made in the, that were just a hit at the biennial. Really awesome, as Angelina says in the chat now. We're so grateful. And I know we have a real special treat for everyone coming up this spring, where we get to flip a little bit the view and let you share with us for the first time some of your own art, as well as some of your other art colleagues. We're very much looking forward to that. Everyone, in the meantime, we have, everyone loves Haifa, right? I mean, the layers of Haifa. Next week's virtual tour with Shachar, come back on the 29th, come back in the spring with Gabriela, come back to each week to the different offerings that we have. Some really incredible programs coming for you, created by the whole team here at AIFL. Everyone have a safe week. We'll just say Lehitrot for now. We hope we've inspired some new thinking and some new life and creativity for everyone as they head into the week wherever you are. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. See you next time.